Coming up in our newscast tonight. Prosecutors demand 30 years behind bars for former President Park Geun-hye. The disgraced leader was removed from office following shocking revelations of a massive corruption scandal. The North Korean delegation led by Kim Young-chul in charge of inter-Korean affairs returned home after setting a positive tone of carrying on the momentum from the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics through to the Paralympics. South Korea's central bank freezes its interest rate for the second straight month, a decision made on expectations the domestic economy will continue solid growth. NEWSCENTER begins now. It's 8 p.m. here in Korea, time for Arirang News Center. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Daniel Choi, coming to you live from our studio in Seoul. 30-year jail time. That's the sentence prosecutors demand for Park Geun-hye, the first democratically elected South Korean president to be impeached. As usual, the disgraced leader removed from office over a massive scandal was not present during the proceedings. The court will deliver its ruling on April 6th. Lee Jung-hyun has our top story.
If the prosecution gets its way, former President Park Geun-hye could be spending the rest of her life behind bars. Tuesday saw a long-awaited hearing at the Seoul Central District Court in which they presented their sentencing demands for South Korea's former conservative leader. The prosecutors have demanded 30 years, which is 5 more than what had been demanded for her close confidant Choi Soon-sil. They reasoned that given the gravity of the case and that Park was the country's leader, a heavier sentencing was necessary. At the hearing, the prosecutor said Park tarnished South Korea's constitutional history and that she harmed constitutional values by privatizing power entrusted to her by the people. On top of jail time, they also sought a fine of 118.5 billion won, or $109 million. Last year, Park became the first South Korean president to be impeached and removed from office. She was indicted last April on 18 charges, including bribery and abuse of power, 15 of which she was found guilty. She was found to have accepted bribes in exchange for political favors for a number of the country's biggest conglomerates, such as SK, Samsung, and Lotte. Park is also accused of letting her longtime confidant Choi Soon-sil meddle in state affairs, even though Choi held no official post. And they are both accused of coercing businesses into paying some $73 million to 2 non-profit organizations Choi controlled. Legal experts had expected a heavy sentence for Park after Choi was sentenced earlier this month to 20 years for 13 overlapping charges. That was the heaviest sentence so far among those involved in the corruption scandal. At Tuesday's hearing, which started at 10 a.m. and wrapped up less than 5 hours later, prosecutors delivered their remarks on Park's sentencing and her lawyers delivered their final defense. Lee Jung-hyun, Arirang News.
Staying with the fate of the daughter of another controversial former president, let's take a look back at how things have developed, including the events that led to her fall from grace.
It all began in October 2016 with a tablet PC discovered by local TV news channel JTBC. The device, containing over 200 presidential documents, was a smoking gun that sparked one of the biggest, if not the biggest, scandal in Korea's modern history. The tablet, later found to be owned by Choi Soon-sil, a longtime friend of former President Park Geun-hye, proved alleged outside interference in state affairs. And on October 25th, the day after the news report, then-President Park Geun-hye made a public apology. The investigation kicks in fast, and just days later, state prosecutors arrest a close friend of the former president on charges of meddling state affairs while holding no government post. The investigative team, led by Special Prosecutor Park Geun-hye, launches with approval of the government. At the National Assembly, lawmakers vote to impeach the president, taking up calls by hundreds of thousands of Koreans who would gather for candlelight vigils every Saturday evening in central Seoul. And on March 15, 2017, Special Prosecutor said Park, who had her impeachment conferred by the Constitutional Court, would be summoned for questioning on the influence peddling scandal. The Justice Office approved Park's pretrial detention shortly before dawn of March 31st, and she began her time behind bars. And on May 23rd, the trial of South Korea's first female president begins. Her charges, 18 of them, including bribery, abuse of power, and leaking state secrets. It wasn't an easy road with unexpected hiccups along the way. The jailed former president had refused to attend hearings on multiple occasions, citing poor health, and her defense team quit en masse when Park condemned the trial as political revenge. And today, the trial comes to a close after 9 long months, and the eyes of a nation will be watching to see what kind of punishment prosecutors demand. Park So-yeon, Arirang News.
Let's move on to other stories now. The two Koreas confirmed the North's participation at next month's Paralympic Games after holding face-to-face talks on Tuesday. However, Pyongyang have decided not to send an arts troupe and cheering squad as previously agreed upon. For details, let's turn to our Kwon Jang-ho.
Another round of inter-Korean talks took place at the border village of Panmunjom on Tuesday, this time to discuss North Korea's participation at the Paralympics, which open on March 9th. The chief representatives from the two sides began the meeting by expressing their mutual satisfaction with the Winter Olympics that had just concluded.
The Olympics was much richer with the North Korean delegation coming, and I believe it contributed greatly to delivering a message of peace and cooperation to the world.
I believe this 23rd Winter Olympics became an opportunity that raised the stature of the Korean people.
Then they sat down to hash out the arrangements for the Paralympics. The South's Unification Ministry revealed that the two sides agreed for the North Korean delegation to arrive on March 7th, 2 days before the opening ceremony. They will cross the land border via the Gyeonggi Line in Paju, north of Seoul. The delegation will consist of 4 North Korean Paralympic Committee members, along with 20 athletes and guardians, 12 more than has been approved by the International Paralympic Committee so far. A final approval from the IPC is expected to be made in the coming days. But unexpectedly, Pyongyang have decided not to send the arts troupe and cheering squad that Seoul had initially agreed to in talks last month. The ministry said that the North Koreans cited some internal reasons and that they felt that the arts troupe and cheering squad that had come for the Olympics had done enough to raise spirits and improve relations. Although Seoul says the talks were successful and that the North's participation in the Paralympics will further make it a celebration for peace and cooperation, the North's sudden change of heart to bring a small delegation raises questions about their commitment to the cause. Kwon Jang-ho, Arirang News.
The regime's high-level delegation returned home today after a 3-day visit to attend the closing ceremony of the Winter Games. Pyongyang's delegation said it was willing to talk with the United States. That was a welcome development. Our Kim Young-gil has the full story.
North Korea's 8-member delegation of high-level officials met with President Moon Jae-in during its stay in South Korea, whereby the officials conveyed the regime's willingness to sit down with the U.S. for talks. The delegation was led by Kim Young-chul, a top ruling party official who's known to be in charge of inter-Korean affairs. Kim's presence in the South, however, stirred a lot of controversy among the political circles in Seoul, as he is also widely believed to have orchestrated multiple attacks against South Korea. In their meeting, Kim told President Moon that improvements in inter-Korean relations need to be achieved in tandem with better Pyongyang-Washington ties. After Kim's remarks were made public, the White House said the U.S. will see if North Korea's stated willingness for talks is a commitment to giving up its nuclear weapons program. President Trump said Monday that talks with North Korea are possible only under the right conditions. Before returning back home on Tuesday, Kim was asked by South Korean reporters about his assessment of the trip. But the official chose to abstain from any comments and just briefly lifted his right hand as a sign of farewell. The North Korean delegation arrived in South Korea at the same time a U.S. delegation led by President Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump, but the two sides did not interact in any form or manner. Kim's trip followed the visit of another North Korean delegation led by the regime's ceremonial head of state Kim Young-nam, as well as Kim Yo-jong, the younger sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The officials, the highest level ever to arrive in South Korea, attended the opening ceremony of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics on February 9th. Kim Young-gil, Arirang News.
Is Washington and Pyongyang on the same page in terms of what they mean by talks? Can South Korea play the role of mediator between the two? Woo Jung-hee sheds light on what the regime may want through dialogue and how Seoul plans to communicate with the U.S.
North Korea's delegation to the closing ceremony of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics repeatedly said the North is willing to talk to the U.S., and they laid out no particular preconditions. It's been pretty rare for North Korea to openly and clearly mention a will to talk, but the U.S. is standing firm. Talks can happen only if they're for denuclearization.
North Korea, who, by the way, wants to talk, as of last night, you heard that, they want to talk. And we want to talk also only under the right conditions.
So President Trump has thrown the ball back to Pyongyang. If the regime wants to sit down with the U.S., then Kim Jong-un will have to decide whether he's willing to discuss denuclearization. But experts believe what North Korea means by talks would not be about giving up its nuclear program, but rather a nuclear freeze.
North Korea may be ready to discuss, first, halting its nuclear and missile tests, and then accepting IAEA inspections and stopping its nuclear facilities. I believe North Korea will reject discarding its nuclear weapons by putting forth conditions that are difficult to meet.
But the expert added that this could be enough for the U.S. to see that conditions for dialogue with North Korea are in place, as the regime's test firing of ICBMs has been a tangible threat for the U.S. On Monday, President Moon urged the North to show a will to denuclearize, but at the same time said Washington should lower the threshold for talks with Pyongyang. To create a greater room for dialogue between Washington and Pyongyang, diplomatic sources say Seoul plans to send its top nuclear envoy to Washington as soon as this week. The goal would be to find areas of common interest between the two sides and ultimately enable any types of talks step by step. 오정희, Arirang News.
A Chinese military plane trespassed into South Korea's air defense zone today. Although Beijing claims it was part of a routine exercise, something to note is the flight route. The aircraft flew near Seoul's territorial waters. Kim Min-ji files us this report.
A Chinese military aircraft flew into South Korea's Air Defense Identification Zone, or CADIS, for over 4 hours on Tuesday. According to Seoul's Joint Chiefs of Staff, the plane entered the CADIS at 9:34 a.m. and later approached about 30 nautical miles, or roughly 56 kilometers, northwest of Ulleungdo Island in the East Sea before flying out of the zone at 2:01 p.m. This prompted South Korea to dispatch fighter jets, including F-15Ks and KF-16s, to monitor the plane's activity. Seoul also called on China via the two countries' hotline to stop acts that raise tensions and could trigger accidental conflicts. A JCS official said that the jet appears to have been a reconnaissance plane and that the government plans to protest the move through various channels, including the military and the foreign ministry. Although Beijing claimed that it was part of a routine exercise, something to note is that the flight route was unusual in that the military aircraft came very close to South Korea's territorial waters. Chinese warplanes had previously flown in the CADIS only south of the peninsula. An air defense ID zone is the airspace over land or water that's set by a state to identify and locate a foreign plane nearing its territory at an early stage. Chinese military planes have entered Korea's air defense zone multiple times since China unilaterally declared its own such zone in 2013, with some parts overlapping with that of Korea's and Japan's. A Chinese military plane last entered the CADIS in late January. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Footage showing Japanese troops killing women they forced into sexual slavery during World War II was made public for the first time at an international conference on wartime sex slavery held in Seoul. The clip was discovered and retrieved last year by a group of Korean scholars and researchers in the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration. For 19 seconds, it shows part of a massacre on September 13, 1944, in which 30 Korean girls were executed by Japanese troops in Tongchong, China. According to the researchers, more than 70 Koreans were brought to the western Chinese city to serve Japanese soldiers in frontline brothels. Only 23 were alive when American and Chinese troops retook Tongchong. The nation's central bank stood pat on its key rate at 1.5%. Kim Hye-sung explains what's behind the decision reached during the BOK's second monetary policy meeting of the year.
The Bank of Korea on Tuesday kept its benchmark interest rate unchanged at 1.5%. This is the second freeze following a rate hike in November when the BOK raised its record low interest rate for the first time in over 6 years by a quarter percentage point.
The domestic economy is expected to continue its solid growth, but growing protectionist measures add uncertainty. Demand-side inflation pressures are expected to be low for the time being, so we unanimously decided to maintain our key rate.
Exports, which grew over 22% on year in January, are likely to continue supporting Korea's economy. But the BOK said Washington's toughening trade policy and corporate restructuring moves such as GM Korea's factory shutdown are some downside risks. Investment slowed down and consumer confidence fell in February. But the Consumer Sentiment Index remains above 100 and Korea's central bank forecasts domestic consumption to grow steadily this year. Inflation, however, is still below the bank's target of 2%.
Consumer prices slowed down, rising 1% on year in January. In addition, Korea's capital market also saw volatility recently, leading to the bank's decision to hold rates.
February's monetary policy meeting is the last one chaired by BOK Governor Lee Ju-yeol as his term ends in March. At the press conference, he said the central bank will make policy decisions by looking at the economy, inflation, household debt, and U.S. monetary policy, as a Korea-U.S. rate gap could risk capital outflows from Korea. Experts say the Bank of Korea will likely raise rates in May or July, with the U.S. Federal Reserve expected to increase rates 4 times in 2018, the first hike coming as early as March. Kim Hye-sung, Arirang News.
General Motors' shocking announcement of wanting to shut down its Kunsan plant immediately had the government debating whether or not to help prevent the American auto giant from pulling out of the nation. We're learning GM will begin its due diligence on the Korean operation, but under certain conditions. Park Geun-hye tells us more.
The Korean government is moving forward with due diligence and talks with General Motors to help get GM Korea back on its feet. Choi Jong-gu, chairman of the Financial Services Commission, told lawmakers Tuesday that the commission plans to swiftly conduct negotiations with the U.S. automaker, but under 3 major principles. Those principles are that GM plays a responsible role in putting the operations back on track. The state-funded Korea Development Bank and GM's local labor union shares the pain of every interested party, and the automaker formulates a long-term strategy for sustainable growth. Choi said that GM agreed to cooperate under such conditions, which they called reasonable, and that they have begun working-level talks. Following its decision to shut down one of its factories in the country earlier this month, GM Korea has requested financial support from the South Korean government to help avoid a massive pullout from the country. The fate of GM Korea's remaining 3 factories in the country will be decided by whether the government injects fresh funding into the Korean operation. The due diligence is likely to be concluded around late March or early April after Korea closely examines the company's finances. Park Geun-hye, Arirang News.
It's been nearly half a decade of discussions on the matter, and finally, a parliamentary committee passed a bill to change the trend of logging unnecessarily long hours after punching in. Kim Mo-kyun zooms in on the move that's designed to improve the nation's working environment.
South Korea has some of the longest working hours in the world. According to OECD data, laborers in Korea worked 2,069 hours on average in 2016, way above the OECD average of 1,763 hours. To tackle this problem, there has been heated debate over the past 5 years on revising the bill on working hours. And finally, the National Assembly has made a big step forward. A parliament committee on Tuesday passed a bill to shorten working hours in South Korea. The National Assembly's Environment and Labor Committee endorsed the bill, which calls for reducing the country's maximum statutory working hours to 52 hours a week from the current 68. Under the current law, the maximum working hours in Korea were 68 hours per week, as the law excluded Saturdays and Sundays as part of the 40-hour working days, making it possible to work an additional 16 hours during the weekend on top of any extended working hours. The revised working hours will now include the weekends in the weekly 40-hour working day period, reducing the maximum hours to 52. The bill will also shorten the working hours for under 18s from 40 hours a week to 35 hours and cut the number of business types exempt from working hour limits from the current 26 to 5. The bill will now be passed to the Judiciary Committee for deliberation and, if passed, will be put for a vote at the National Assembly's plenary session, possibly as early as Wednesday. However, a labor law expert says there have been continued objections from many industries amid worries that the revision could harm productivity.
The problem is that workers are worrying that the new bill could lower their salary due to reduced working hours, while business owners are worrying that they might have to pay additional personnel expenses for extra hours outside of the bill's 40 working hour limit.
The expert said that it's important to keep in mind the purpose of this bill, which is to protect the health and the quality of life of laborers. He added that both sides should be able to comply with the changes by bearing in mind the original motive. To minimize the impact of the possible changes, the committee says the new law will be enforced gradually over the next 3 years. It will be applied to firms with 300 workers or more from this July, while firms with 50 to 299 workers will adapt the system in 2020, and those with 5 to 49 workers will follow it from 2021. Kim Mo-gyan, Arirang News.
The 2018 Mobile World Congress is now on. 5G technologies are front and center at the biggest of such events in the global stage. Kim Ji-yeon has more on what to watch out for at this year's edition in Barcelona.
5G, the Internet of Things, and artificial intelligence are at the forefront of this year's Mobile World Congress, which kicked off in Barcelona on Monday. Products and services related to the fifth generation of Internet connectivity were laid out by telecommunications operators from around the world, signaling that the wireless tech may arrive sooner than previously forecast.
The key topics at this year's Mobile World Congress are really around 5G and artificial intelligence, and how the two coming together, the 5G networks, really creating a platform that allows artificial intelligence to thrive.
Some of the eye-catching products on display include connected cars and taxi drones. This one unveiled by Chinese firm Huawei, which will be able to carry passengers and be controlled by 5G networks. Humanoid robots, virtual reality simulations, and a new wave of smartphones running on 5G tech are also being unveiled during the event. Meanwhile, major Korean telecommunications operator KT and his partner Intel are showing off their services following a successful run of their commercial 5G network at the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, including a system that used hundreds of cameras to capture athletes and broadcast footage in real time to VR viewers. The firms are expected to partner up for an update of their 5G services at the upcoming 2020 Tokyo Olympics. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Time to turn to Michelle Bach at the Weather Center for the updates you need. Michelle, the air quality was bad all day here in Seoul, but I hear rain is in the forecast.
That's right, Daniel. Now, the capital city and the upper regions of the country was covered by the smog, and the air quality is still bad as we speak, with the fine dust levels about 2 times higher than the usual. However, thanks to a nationwide rain tomorrow, the air will clear up and most for sure provide some relief to the severe dry conditions we've been experiencing recently. And the southern regions will receive the most amount of precipitation, while the capital area should expect between 5 and 20 millimeters of rainfall. And tomorrow's rain is expected to last until Thursday morning. Tomorrow, Seoul will wake up to 4 degrees Celsius, while Daegu and Busan begins at 4 and 8 degrees respectively. And temperatures in Seoul will rise up to 8 degrees. Gwangju and Busan will peak higher at 12 degrees. After the rain, the mercury will drop again, but as we hit the weekend, readings will bounce back to the teens. I'll leave you with the weather conditions around the world.
These are the stories we could squeeze into tonight's edition of Arirang News Center. Wherever you may be tuning in from, thank you for watching.